All right, Chapter 5 deals with public opinion and political socialization. In other words, how do people feel about what's going on around them, and where do they get their political opinions? That is the main idea, the theme of this particular chapter. It's a pretty detailed one, and I'm not going to be able to go over all the specific details. So be sure you're reading more so than any other chapter. You need to get into the book on this one. Now, let's talk about the characteristics of public opinion. There are 5 things that uh, that we can sort of look at that ring true most of the time dealing with public opinion. What are the characteristics? The public's attitude toward any given governmental policy changes over time. It's just going to. People today do not feel the same way about interracial marriage as they did 50, 60, 80, 100 years ago. People today feel very different about what does jail look like, what does incarceration look like than they did, say, in 1815. So in other words, it changes over time. Sometimes it's generational, but not always. Public opinions do place boundaries on what types of public policy are allowable. In other words, if let's just say mass incarceration, if there's enough of a public outcry, then mass incarceration will be something that would be dealt with most likely. Now, as we'll see in a minute, government doesn't always respond to the public outcry. Government doesn't, but we'll get to that in a moment. The third one, the citizens willing to register their opinions. If asked by a pollster, those people that conduct polls, citizens are usually willing to register their opinions on matters outside of their expertise. In other words, I will tell you how I feel about it. I may not understand it, but I'll tell you how I feel about it. And so it may or may not be a good indicator of what we need to do, but it does show us how the public feels about it. Government tends to respond to public opinion, and that's pretty self-explanatory. But sometimes there are things that the people want that the government does not respond to. People have been calling for immigration reform since the 1980s. No measurable immigration reform has really happened since then. Okay. Now, and here's a chart you can take a look at dealing with how do people feel about climate change. How many feel it's a very serious problem? Well, you can see where the United States ranks among the others. Now, here's the question. Before 1930s, there was no polling. It just didn't exist. If you wanted to know how sort of the people felt, then you had to look at letters to the editor, you had to look at news stories, you had to look at how they voted and voting returns and various things like that. Polling begins, though, with Gallup and several other agencies in the 1930s. And how does this fit into majoritarian and pluralist model? Well, you can kind of take a look. Majoritarian, the government should do what what public wants. Well, how do we do that? Well, it's very easy to tell what the public wants through a majoritarian. The majority of people say this, and Americans prefer this because it's easy. Pluralist model, pluralist model is based upon groups. This is a little harder to understand, and so therefore people tend to vilify it. When you hear people say, well, government shouldn't be all about special interest, this is dealing with the pluralist model. It's there, it's just a part of it, and actually if people were a little bit more informed about it, then, and maybe not quite so ambivalent, it would make a little bit more sense. So hopefully you'll understand this moving beyond this course. And then how has opinion changed? Well, here's a little political cartoon dealing with legalization of marijuana. Look at how many of the western states have adopted laws which allow it, even though the federal government still has it as illegal. All right, now in order to do a sampling, you've got to have random is better. The larger the sampling, the more accurate your polling is going to be. The amount of variation in the population, in other words, if you only poll an upper middle class Caucasian neighborhood, it's not going to represent the nation as a whole. But if you took, let's say, the entire city of Dallas, and you should be able to get a fairly decent cross section in the polling of what's going on. So again, these are 3 things, and accuracy is determined by those mainly. Now, another thing we might want to consider is what is the means by which the data is collected. For example, if I'm going to cold call, pick up my phone and just call random numbers, that meets most of these qualifications. However, you know what? If you're like me, I don't answer the phone if I don't know the number. What if one of those numbers that I sort of wait for the message to pick up on my voicemail, what if it's a pollster? I'm not calling the pollster back. They're just going to call somebody else to replace me. So again, that might skew the data a little bit moving forward. All right, in 1948, Harry Truman was a beneficiary of the fact that the polls didn't really do a very good job. The polls showed that that Truman was going to lose. Well, at the end of the day, he won, but the newspapers ran the story based upon the polls, and the Chicago Daily Tribune got it wrong. All right, there are three distribution shapes. We're going to take a look at these. An asymmetrical distribution, it's called a skewed. Almost divided evenly, called bimodal, and normal, sometimes you'll hear it referred to as a bell curve. And I'll take a look at these. This is kind of interesting. What did the polls say, and how did the reality of the voting work out in all presidential elections since 1936? If you were in class, we were in class together going over this, I'd probably spend some time analyzing this chart, but time is of the essence on these little videos here. All right, here's our skewed. Notice that it's very asymmetrical. Favor or oppose. The question is, what is Americans' position on death penalty? 67% say yes, we need it. 28% say no, we don't. It's very one-sided, and the don't knows really don't matter. Now, position on will health care law improve the quality of health care? Notice these are pretty evenly divided. It's pretty evenly split. And the no effects is a legitimate answer. It's not a throwaway like a don't know. It's like, I don't think it's going to do anything. It's a legitimate response. Three responses, and pretty evenly divided amongst the three. Bimodal, bi meaning two, so you kind of have this mountains and valley thing going on here. And then look at ideological self-placement. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You've got 7 choices here, from extremely liberal to extremely conservative. Notice that most people fall, 31% fall within the moderate category. Okay, but you kind of have this bell curve. It's usually what grades look like in a typical class when you start figuring grades. You kind of have these, some folks that do very, very well and some not quite so well, and quite a few that hang out in the middle. This is a standard deviation or a standard bell curve. All right. A stable distribution changes very, very little over time. And I'll show you a chart in a minute. Ideological and partisan orientations tend to sort of be fairly stable, but sometimes changes do occur within subgroups. Take a look at this. 65 plus. Well, if you were 65 plus in 1972, you're still 65 plus in 2012 if you're still around. But if you are 17 in 1972, well, then you're going to be in the next category by 1980, and you'll be in the next category by, and so this is a little bit hard to get your brains wrapped around. But the question is, are young people more liberal than their grandparents, than their parents are parents? Well, looking at a chart like this, I would say the answer would be yes. Look at how the 65 plus changes. It kind of goes up and down depending on what's happening. But here in between 2004 and 2012, the number climbs a bit. Well, the folks that were very liberal here are sort of being counted in the chart here. So anyway, but I think it's a fairly stable distribution. Political socialization is something else we need to deal with, how individuals become aware of politics. And for the most part, home. You know, who do your mom and dad listen to on the radio? What about news broadcasts like Fox News, CNN? I mean, you're going to have a little bit of that. Dinner table discussions about who to vote for, that's going to have some kind of an impact on you. It is an early agent of socialization. There's something called the primacy principle. What is learned first is learned best. And you know, you've heard that in sports or anything else. Learn it right the first time. If you have to undo your learning, it's going to be all the harder. Well, the same thing works with politics. Something else called the structuring principle. What is learned first structures later learning. It's building a foundation, and things are sort of piled on top of that. Family is usually linked to the earliest political memories of a family. Children learn party identification from the family. There's transmission, a model of partisanship. In other words, what party do you belong to? Many, many times begins here with the family. Now, that doesn't mean there's not rebellion sometimes on down the line. School, elementary school, you learn your norms of behavior. You know, I once heard everything I need to know I learned in kindergarten. Well, you learn how to get along with people. And just basic ideas about your society. social studies and other things. High school, greater awareness of the political process. You're getting close to voting age. And then in college, you start to see questioning of authority as dominant political values. And you begin to sort of shape who you are based upon that sort of scaffolding, more or less. Okay, community and peers, peer pressure. If you live in a very diverse community, well, then anything goes. Those people you surround yourself with are going to affect you. If you're in a very homogenous community, there's going to be a strong pressure to conform to that homogenous community. For example, like church groups and that sort of a thing. And it continues on. Peer groups as you get older, greater importance. Who are your friends? Who are you hanging out with? Who do you try to fit in with? Media is a socializing agent, and people are going to gain perspective as they get older too. In other words, a 17-year-old that doesn't own a house, and shares an apartment with a roommate is going to have a very, very different view than when you start paying property tax on a 2,000 square foot home. That's just the reality of it. As you have a family, your views begin to change. All right, now the next few slides deal with a number of values, and some of what I have here is not necessarily matching particularly with your text. So I'm going to run through the next, and we're going to pick it up at the end of these 6. All right. The degree of ideological thinking and public opinion. Voters tend to not use ideological concepts when discussing politics. In other words, we tend to not throw liberal and conservative down quite often. Now maybe there's a definition that can be used there, but they tend to not be used in everyday conversations. Ideological thinking, sort of the general consensus or the general view is that liberals tend to be seen as generous. Now sometimes it's generous with other people's money, but looking for government to create programs to help out various groups. Conservatives tend to be cautious, tend to be somewhat skeptical, and tend to favor small government, while liberals tend to favor large government. Conservatives tend to oppose higher taxes. Liberals tend to support them because of what they hope to see done with that tax money, for example. And tax is just one element that falls within this category. Many people settle on moderate, sort of that middle of the road, even if you do tend to lean one way or the other. And especially if you don't understand the differences, moderate is sort of a safe title that you might be able to brand yourself with. People oftentimes can't decide if they're liberal or conservative. Sorry about the buzz, Amber Alert. All right, let's take a look at the 2 themes. 2 themes run through people's minds when they're asked to describe if they are liberal or conservative. One theme associates liberals with change and conservatives with tradition. I think that's accurate. The other theme has to do with equality. Liberals tend to support intervention to promote economic equality, usually stronger, larger, more powerful government to do it. Conservatives tend to favor less government intervention and more individual freedoms in their economic activity. Again, less tax, less regulation. Conservatives do not necessarily oppose equality, but they put a higher value on freedom than on equality when the two come into conflict with one another. Yet conservatives are not above restricting freedom when threatened with the loss of social order. That's why conservatives tend to oppose the idea of same-sex marriage prior to the court case. I can't remember the name of it right offhand. The Oberfels case in 2015. All right, so again, take a look at these charts. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over those. Ideological types in the United States. Here are those 4 that we looked at in earlier chapters. Liberals tend to favor freedom over order and equality and freedom. These are those 3 concepts from chapter 1. Conservatives tend to favor freedom over equality and order over freedom. Libertarians tend to favor freedom over both equality and order, and communitarians favor order and equality over freedom. That's just a recap of that chart we looked at several chapters ago. Okay, where do these social groups tend to fall? I think that's something I need to look at in an individual video, although it will not be a long one. In fact, it'll only cover maybe 5 or 6 slides. All right, I'm going to let you go now, and I will catch you on the next one. Thanks for tuning in. Have a good day.